the basic setup of the autonomic nervous system. So you have the spinal cord, you have neuron 1, that is the ganglionic neuron, or we could say, the preganglionic neuron because it runs into the ganglion. Then it synapses on neuron 2, which exits the ganglion, so I call this a postganglionic neuron, and then synapses with the effector. So you can see neuron 1, neuron 2, synapse 1, and synapse 2, and that's what is referenced up here. Now, for those of you who have your table with you, you can probably, you might even clarify me a little bit with some information. I don't have the word bank with me, so I'm going to kind of just go over this from memory. So if I miss something or I use a term that's not on the word bank, please just let me know. So let's see if I can zoom in enough to write in these little boxes. Okay, so we start off, remember the first column here is the sympathetic division, the second column is the parasympathetic division. So we first can say, well, what are the location of the preganglionic neurons? And so sympathetic division we know as thoracolumbar, because the cell bodies of the sympathetic division of those neurons, of that neuron 1, remember at the bottom, so it's saying location of preganglionic neurons, it's saying where is the cell body of neuron 1 is the other way to say this. So thoracolumbar, and then parasympathetic is craniosacral, because sympathetic division neurons extend from the thoracic region and the lumbar region of the spinal cord. Parasympathetic extend from the cranial region, so that's why you have a lot of cranial nerves in the parasympathetic. The main one, 85% of all parasympathetic outflow comes from the vagus nerve. So I'm going to rewrite this in red just so it stands out a little bit more. Craniosacral. So once again, feel free to put in the chat or turn off your audio if you have any questions. Now we get to rows 2 and 3, and these are related. What's the relative position of the autonomic ganglion? You can see parasympathetic is close to or within the target organ. Sympathetic is close to spinal cord. So if we scroll down here, you can see that if you are, think about these as 2 rubber bands. So we have rubber band 1 and we have rubber band 2. So think about this. If we take the ganglion and we shift it closer to neuron 1, because if sympathetic is close to the spinal cord, if it's close to the spinal cord, when we shift this closer to the spinal cord, what happens to neuron 1? It gets shorter, and what happens to neuron 2? It gets longer. So that ties into row 3, relative lengths of preganglionic fiber to the postganglionic fiber. So that's short, long, and then of course that makes this long, short. And you'll notice that a lot of these rows end up kind of tied together. Okay, row 4, the neurotransmitter released at the ganglionic synapse. So what is this? That is synapse 1. Synapse 1 is the ganglionic synapse, so you can see labeled as synapse 1. So what is the neurotransmitter released here? That's what it's asking. What neurotransmitter is released here? Now, your book or some of the questions on your quiz are worded where I worded it, what is the neurotransmitter released at the ganglionic synapse? Your book will word it as the neurotransmitter released by the preganglionic neuron. But realize it's the same thing. This is the preganglionic neuron that releases neurotransmitter into synapse 1. So same thing. So it's what are the neurotransmitters here? And I already told you that that is acetylcholine in the sympathetic division. And if you look in the parasympathetic, it is also acetylcholine. So you can see that in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released at synapse 1. when we think about neurotransmitters, I want you to think of a neurotransmitter as like a language that is spoken. So just like I'm speaking English now, some of you may speak Spanish, some of you may speak Russian, some of you may speak Mandarin, some of you may speak Farsi, whatever it is. Think of the neurotransmitter like the language that is spoken. If I am speaking English, it only makes sense for me to speak English if I am speaking to people who have receptors for English. So if I'm standing in a room out in the wilderness of Russian Siberia, and everyone in the room only understands Russian, if I speak English, then it does not matter what words I'm saying. They do not have the receiver, the receptor for English. So if I have a synapse that is releasing acetylcholine, we need to have receptors that bind acetylcholine. And so receptors that bind acetylcholine are called cholinergic receptors. So you can see acetylcholine, cholinergic, acetylcholine, cholinergic. Excuse me. Notice how row 4 and 5 are connected. Whatever the neurotransmitter that is released must have the complementary receptor for it to make any biological or physiological sense. So if you have acetylcholine released here, then cholinergic will be the receptor. So let's take a moment here to talk about acetylcholine at this synapse. Maybe some of you are thinking, wait, I know that sympathetic and parasympathetic have opposing effects. But if they have opposing effects, why do they have the same neurotransmitter? Because isn't the neurotransmitter going to tell you what happens? Like, you would think that for one system to be excitatory and one system to be inhibitory, you would have different neurotransmitters. But here's what's important, is that when we look at synapse 1, synapse 1 in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic is always excitatory. Always excitatory. You know, what I mean by this is not excitatory meaning stimulating. I mean this in a physiological sense. Excitatory meaning, I mean, I guess you could say stimulating, but not in the terms of, like, when we think excitement, we think increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. I want you to think about this as excitatory in a physiological sense, meaning always leading to action potentials. Excitatory in the neurophysiological sense. Excitatory meaning always leading to action potentials. So the phrase I like to use is that synapse 1 is always, let's see, where do I want to write this? Synapse 1 is always encouraging. It is always encouraging. So I want you to think about this. Is encouragement a good thing? So if you have someone, if you have a friend who is encouraging, is it a good thing? Well, no, because it depends on what they're encouraging you to do. I encourage you to donate to your local nonprofit food shelter. That is good encouragement. I encourage you to travel to Mexico and buy crystal meth, smuggle it across the border, and sell it for a profit. That is bad encouragement. So at row 4, at synapse 1, all we know is that the presence of acetylcholine is just encouraging something else, but we haven't determined what that something else is yet. But just know acetylcholine at synapse 1 is always encouraging. What is it encouraging us to do? We're going to find that out in later rows. So any questions on that so far? So hopefully you can see we're kind of just logically following through with this. Okay, so now we get to row 6, neurotransmitters released at the effector synapse. We already see that in parasympathetic, notice parasympathetic synapse 1 was acetylcholine, parasympathetic synapse 2 is acetylcholine. What do we see in the sympathetic division? We see norepinephrine. I think, does your book just have epinephrine and norepinephrine and acetylcholine? Yeah. So let's do this. Different books focus on slightly different things. So I'm going to do it this way. In sympathetic synapse 2, it is primarily norepinephrine. There is some epinephrine released, but then the other one would be acetylcholine. So like the majority of the neurotransmitters is norepinephrine, with a very, very small amount being acetylcholine, where 100% of the neurotransmitter in synapse 2 in parasympathetic is acetylcholine. Majority norepinephrine, synapse 2, sympathetic, a little bit acetylcholine in synapse 2, sympathetic. So notice, if the language is acetylcholine, what is the receptor we must have? We must have a cholinergic receptor, and we can see it matches here. We can do it in reverse. If you have a receptor that is cholinergic, well, then it would make sense that someone is speaking acetylcholine language. Now, in the same vein, if norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter, it has receptors that are called adrenergic receptors. Norepinephrine and epinephrine use adrenergic receptors. So where does that name come from? Well, epinephrine and norepinephrine have another name, and this is what you're familiar with. Epinephrine's other name is adrenaline. Norepinephrine's other name is noradrenaline. So adrenaline, adrenergic, adrenaline, adrenergic. So that's the connection between those two. So now we can put it all together. If we have acetylcholine as the language spoken, we have cholinergic receptors. If norepinephrine or epinephrine is the neurotransmitter or language that is spoken, then we have adrenergic receptors. Then we can come down here into row number 8, identify the peripheral ganglia. So sympathetic has a very consistent kind of order. So it goes 1 to 2, and then 2 to 3. And I don't want you to go into as much detail as your book goes into about all of the individual pathways, but I do want you to know the 3 train stops of the sympathetic. So the first one is the sympathetic chain, or your book uses trunk ganglia. Remember, a ganglion is a group of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. 2 are called collateral ganglia. And then 3 would be the adrenal medulla, or medullae, which are located on top of each kidney. So think of it like a train track. If you are exiting the spinal cord, so here you are, you're exiting the spinal cord, the first stop is going to be a sympathetic chain ganglion. And then you can travel out of the sympathetic chain ganglion to get into a collateral ganglion. And then you can go from the collateral ganglion, you could even go, you could just keep passing through, and you could get into the adrenal medulla. Parasympathetic, I don't need you to know which ganglia are associated with which cranial nerves or associated with which effectors, but I do want you to be aware of the parasympathetic ganglia. So we have ciliary ganglia, let's see, pterygopalatine, otic, and I think submandibular is another one. I've just given you 3 of the 4: ciliary, pterygopalatinotic, and submandibular. So then we get into the box of functions, all of the functions. So notice sympathetic is summarized as fight or flight, meaning sympathetic helps you is short-term survival. Short-term survival. And when I say short-term, I'm meaning like minutes. Rest and digest, we can think of this as really maintaining homeostasis. We want to be under long-term parasympathetic control. In thinking about the differences of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, for those of you, I think about the TV show, it's crazy to think that it was popular like 15 years ago, but the TV show Lost, if you've seen Lost. In the very first episode, Lost begins with a plane crash. And so imagine that you just crashed on a deserted island. Your plane crashes, what's the first thing that you realize? Oh my gosh, the plane crashed, there's dead bodies, there's people hurting, there's fire, there's explosions, I need to survive. This is short-term survival, this is sympathetic. This is, what do I need to do to survive for the next 2 minutes? So you are fighting as hard as you have to, you are running as quickly as you can, you are using as much strength as you can to flip over cars, to drag bodies out of the wreckage, short-term survival. Once you survive those first 5 or 10 or 30 minutes and you go, okay, well, we're not in danger of dying in an explosion. I have stopped the bleeding. I have moved away from the fire, from the flames. You can start to relax a little bit. So parasympathetic takes over. So now you get to breathe a little bit more, you're calming down. And now, of course, you look around and you see you're on a deserted island. So now you have to figure out long-term survival. So do you see how sympathetic was short-term, acute, maximum production of energy, maximum usage of energy for survival? Then parasympathetic is more long-term. And so you also see you switch from short-term stress to long-term stress now that you're living on a deserted island. So everything with sympathetic is designed to help you punch as hard as you can, run as fast as you can, use as much energy as you can just to live for the next 2 minutes. So I'm not going to write all of these out, but I'll kind of just go off of memory in summarizing each of these functions. So think about this with fight or flight. All of these functions are designed to utilize more ATP, utilize more oxygen to better get in oxygen, to better move nutrients to your tissues and remove waste. So fight or flight sympathetic is things like increased heart rate. Increasing heart rate means that we can push more materials, more nutrients, more oxygen to your working tissues. We bronchodilate because bronchodilation allows you to get in more oxygen into your body. More oxygen in, more oxygen into your blood, more oxygen to your tissues, better utilization of ATP. Our pupils dilate. More light comes in. We can see better. We're more aware. Let's see, what else? So sympathetic is, in 95% of cases, sympathetic is the only system controlling blood vessels. So sympathetic causes us to vasodilate, to increase blood flow to the tissues and decrease blood flow to the digestive system. We don't care about digesting that hamburger you just ate because you may be dead within 2 minutes. We want to survive, so we shunt the blood, we send the blood to the working tissues. So we vasodilate to the muscles, we vasoconstrict to the digestive and the urinary tracts, to the non-necessary organs. Let's see, along with that is that you reduce blood flow to the kidneys, so you're not going to be producing urine, you're not filtering as much blood because you don't need to produce urine, you might be dead in 2 minutes. So we shift blood away from there. Sympathetic increases muscle contraction, because you increase the release of acetylcholine. So you release acetylcholine into the neuromuscular junction more effectively, so your muscles contract harder. You stimulate the adrenal glands, so only the sympathetic innervates the adrenal glands. You stimulate the adrenal glands to release norepinephrine and epinephrine as hormones. Once again, these are stimulating hormones that increase your heart rate, increase your breathing rate, increase oxygen utilization in your body. Also, as kind of an unrelated function, but sympathetic controls ejaculation in the reproductive system. Let's see. I think, did I cover all of the sympathetic functions there? I think. Just let me know if I forgot one. So now parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. Like I said, homeostasis. We want to be under long-term parasympathetic control. So what does sympathetic? Well, parasympathetic does the opposite of a lot of the sympathetic functions. Decreases heart rate, decreases breathing rate, bronchoconstriction, pupillary constriction. And so with bronchoconstriction, I want you to realize that if somebody's having an asthma attack and they can't breathe, they are bronchoconstricting. So an asthma attack is actually a parasympathetic attack. And if you're a parent, or maybe this is even for you, if you are allergic to something or you have asthma, your inhaler is a stimulant. It's epinephrine. Or if you have an EpiPen to deal with an allergic reaction, an EpiPen is obviously epinephrine. This is why if you're having an asthma attack and you can't breathe, you hit yourself with epinephrine to stimulate the sympathetic system. And what did we already say sympathetic is? Bronchodilation, is to increase those passageways to help you breathe. So parasympathetic sends blood, so it quiets your sympathetic system so that you can send blood to your digestive organs. Also, it allows you to send blood to your reproductive organs. So it deals with engorgement in the penis and in the vulva. So in both the male and female reproductive tracts, it deals with, in men, it would deal with erection, but engorgement of the penis is the same thing as engorgement of the clitoris and the other spongy tissues of the vulva. And so it deals with erection as well, which is a relaxation response. So you kind of see an interesting relationship here. Is it for men? Obviously, as you get older, but even in some young men, that ED, erectile dysfunction. Well, one of the causes of erectile dysfunction is stress. So if you are stressed, it will be hard to have an erection. Well, why is that? Well, physiologically, what is stress? Sympathetic. Well, we already said that sympathetic, when it is active, it inhibits parasympathetic. So if parasympathetic is in control of erection, if you are stressed, the sympathetic system is actually going to inhibit that relaxation. So it's very hard to have an erection. And then, of course, you can see a negative downward spiral. Is it you're stressed, so you can't get an erection, which then in and of itself causes stress, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. This is also why one of the treatments for erectile dysfunction, chemically, of course, is Viagra, sildenafil, Cialis, all of these things. Well, what they do is they increase the presence of nitric oxide at that synapse to these reproductive tissues, to the spongy tissues, and nitric oxide is a vasodilator. If you have been a first responder, you know a first responder, they carry nitroglycerin tablets that dissolve under the tongue. So if somebody's having a heart attack, you can dissolve that nitroglycerin that vasodilates the blood vessels because the nitroglycerin gets turned into nitric oxide. So it is a vasodilator. Let's see, anything else in parasympathetic? It stimulates the bladder, so it causes the bladder to constrict, and constriction of the bladder increases urination. Constriction of the bladder is associated with urination. Is that, did I cover everything? Is there any things that I left off on the word bank? just let me know. I'm going to mention something else here. This isn't on your word bank, but you certainly can add it on your word bank because it is in your LOs. Is I want you to know that there are different types of receptors. So when we talk about cholinergic, there's two different types of cholinergic, and this is the equivalent if I'm saying if acetylcholine is the language that's spoken, you need a cholinergic receptor. But let's take English. There are very different types of English, right? There's British English and there's American English. But even in America, the English that we speak here in South Louisiana is different than the English we speak in New England, that's spoken in New England. So the words, it can be the same word, but the words mean different things. And so it's not the language that is spoken that is most important. It is the receiver of that language that determines the response. So it's always the receptor that determines response, not the neurotransmitter per se. Obviously, you have to speak the word to receive it, but it's the receiver that determines the response. So let's go back up to Synapse 1. So Synapse 1, acetylcholine is released, and it's cholinergic. Well, I said that Synapse 1 is always excitatory, is always encouraging, and that's because the cholinergic receptors here are some special type of receptors that are called nicotinic receptors. So it's cholinergic, nicotinic. You probably shouldn't have to think too hard as to why are these called nicotinic? What is the other chemical that binds to nicotinic receptors? Obviously, it's nicotine. Well, for those of you who have or currently smoke, nicotine is a stimulant. Why is nicotine a stimulant? Because when nicotine gets in your body, it's going to bind to these receptors. So it's going to bind to both parasympathetic and sympathetic, but why is it more of a sympathetic stimulator? Because when sympathetic activity increases, the sympathetic system inhibits the parasympathetic. So this is why smoking is a stimulant. And so smoking increases metabolism. It could even be used to kind of maintain weight loss. Certainly not the best way to maintain weight loss, but it is a way. When you're smoking, you increase your metabolism. But notice what you also do when you're smoking. Smoking and putting that nicotine in your body is basically activating your sympathetic system when you shouldn't have to. So when you smoke, your heart rate's going to increase. When you smoke, your blood pressure is going to increase. When you smoke, you're going to reduce blood flow to your digestive organs. So basically, when you smoke, you're making it harder to relax physiologically. This is why recently vaping has become a big deal. And I remember hearing a guy on the radio, local radio, who was saying, I used to smoke all this, but I'm so thankful to switch to vaping. Vaping's healthier, et cetera, et cetera. What people don't seem to realize is that while smoking is bad because of all of the carcinogens that are in smoke, one, we don't even know some of the stuff that's in what you vape. But realize that if you go from smoking to vaping, you're still taking in nicotine, and nicotine is the problem. So even if you're vaping is not the healthier option because you're still addicted and you're still suffering under the effects of the nicotine. And so it's important to realize what nicotine does in your body, and you can see physiologically exactly why nicotine does that in your body. When we jump down here to Synapse 2, let's look at the cholinergic receptors here. Synapse 1, the cholinergic receptors were nicotinic. Synapse 2, they are what we call muscarinic. Muscarinic receptors are known as muscarinic because they also bind a chemical called muscarine. Muscarine is the chemical found in poisonous mushrooms, which if you have muscarine poisoning, it's depressive. Your heart rate is too low, bradycardia. Your blood pressure is too low. You're too lethargic because remember, 100% of synapse 2s are parasympathetic. Just a very small percent of synapse 2s are muscarinic and sympathetic. So if you have muscarine in your body, you're going to really activate the parasympathetic system. So you're going to be too low, too depressed, too unexcitable. And then the final thing that I want you to look at, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Your book does a good job. So let me just create a new page because I'm kind of running out of space there. Let's see. Is when we look at adrenergic receptors. Let me make sure you can see this. Let's look at the different types of adrenergic receptors. So adrenergic receptors, of course, are all located at synapse 2, which is the effector synapse. So at the effector, we have alpha 1, alpha 2, oops, and then we have beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. Remember, same neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, but 5 different receptors. So you can have 5 different responses based on which receptor they bind to. So I'm not going to go through each one right now, but I do want you to know just the basic function of each one. So for instance, beta 1 receptors found in the heart. When beta 1 receptors are stimulated, your heart rate goes up. So you can just kind of think of it that way. So just keep track of, very simply, what is, once again, what is the receptor and what does it do? If you know what it does, then you know its location. But don't go into, your book has a big long chart of each synapse and each effector and what type of receptor it is. Just know in general, what does alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 receptors do? Very one sentence function on each of those. So of course, all of that is located. Those receptors are located right here. So alpha 1, 2, beta 1, 2, and 3.